Well, hello and welcome to this edition of Insights with Ministry Pacific. I'm Roy Harriman, and we are delighted to have with us Barry Young, Vice President of Church Security at Strategos International. Barry, thank you for joining us today.
Roy, it's an honor to be here, and I'm just grateful for the ministry and the organization of Ministry Pacific, and excited for today.
Yes, well, thank you. Well, Barry's a gifted and passionate speaker. I've got to hear him many times. And he has a unique passion for ministry and also for security. And he travels the nation, helping train and consult with large corporations on down to churches of 50 people and everything in between. So we're delighted to have his expertise with us here as we talk about security for churches and nonprofits. So, Barry, if it's all right, we'll jump right in and make the most of our time with you.
Absolutely.
Okay. So many churches, if I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, up until about 2017, really kept their head in the sand about church security. And this idea, it could never happen here until the Sutherland Springs shooting in Texas occurred. Dozens of people died. A small town, a small church. It was the perfect, it could never happen here scenario, and yet it happened. And after that, church security jumped in with a frenzy that it had never experienced before. Training was booked, people were getting trained, and then the pandemic hit. And if there is anything good about the pandemic, it has been that a lot of these shootings have stopped sensibly because people haven't been able to get out in the manner that they used to. In the situation that we're in now, it's a strange environment for churches, for everyone. What are some of the security challenges of today in this new world that we live in that we've never experienced or thought would come?
Well, Roy, that's a great question. Just like what you were saying, November 5th, 2017 at First Baptist Church, Sutherland Springs, when 46 people were shot in a town of 400, it changed everything. And even though we're in a pandemic, there are still a lot of church violence going on. Just last year, CBS.com said there were 15,000 people killed by a firearm in America, and CBS.com said there were 30,000 people injured by a firearm in America. Now, some unique challenges with the pandemic is a lot of churches are kind of slipping back into that pre-2017 mindset. Well, since the pandemic's here, since we've got smaller services, we don't need a church security ministry. And what's happened is we're now starting to see more and more church attacks, even in the pandemic. And so what happens is there's an old law enforcement phrase that we say, keep your head on the swivel. And while I'm grateful for Zoom ministries and online ministries, many churches are now starting to meet back in face-to-face, but unfortunately, that's kind of crept back in that we don't need to be concerned about church security anymore.
It definitely is a unique environment, something churches have never faced before. And I think many of the churches that are our customers at Ministry Pacific are doing well just to navigate all the challenges of COVID. And so anything that doesn't have to happen, and it doesn't happen. And sometimes, unfortunately, church security can be put into that environment. Barry, so for a church that's not a mega church, mega churches get a lot of press, but as I understand it, the average size church in America is under 100 people. So for an average church that struggles to do basic things, how can it begin having a church security ministry without feeling overwhelmed, this kind of all or nothing feeling?
Well, that's a great question. One thing we do at Strategos is we specialize in small churches. Now, we do train some of the largest churches in America, the largest Southern Baptist Church in America, Bellevue Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee. We do their training and a lot of other mega church trainings, but we specialize on churches that are smaller. And there's three main areas we want any church to focus on, regardless of size. The first area we want churches to focus on is the parking lot. 74% of church attacks start in the parking lot. If every church in America just had one person in the parking lot with a radio that was just sharing the love of God, welcoming people, greeting people, we always ask this question: do criminals want to be seen or unseen? And the question's unseen. The moment a church puts somebody in the parking lot just as a loving greeter, risk is reduced. The second thing is the moment a church has an organized, trained usher and greeter team, and it may be 1 to 5 people, but they're making sure the doors are covered. They're making sure everybody is seen, greeted. Again, we start to reduce risk. And then lastly, if the church can develop a specified team of 1 to 5 people that are focusing on strictly church security. Now, of course, as a church gets larger, they can have more people on the team. But I tell every church, if it's a church of 85 to 100 people, 3 people can make the difference. 1 in the parking lot, 1 in the foyer, and then 1 in the sanctuary. Just making sure they're aware. And there's one other trend that we add to this. You know you're doing church security correctly when the church becomes more friendly, and you know you're doing church security incorrectly when the church becomes less friendly.
That's excellent input. So if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is someone has evil intent when they pull into a church, if they see that the church is paying attention, someone's out greeting cars, someone's out greeting at the door, that simply probably unarmed experience of just seeing, hey, someone's paying attention, I'm going to encounter some resistance here, that may deter someone from doing something wrong.
We have numerous pieces of empirical data that prove that point. Oftentimes, what we see with people that attack a church is they're looking for doors that don't have somebody at the doors. They're looking for a way to get in the parking lot where nobody sees them. They're looking a way to slip into a sanctuary where they aren't greeted. And what happens is when we raise that greeting, that first impression, that sharing the love of God, number one, we want to show people the love of Jesus. But also, secondarily, it does start to provide a layer of safety and security.
So Barry, at Ministry Pacific, our goal is to reduce risk and to see people protected in their congregations. So some people may have the idea that how does church security reduce risk if you're unleashing a team of people, maybe they're armed or at least they're ready to engage in a confrontation? That would seem that it would increase the risk of a problem. Can you address that for us?
Absolutely. So one of the things we do at Strategos, we do over 300 church trainings a year. And one of the things we say is we first of all got to start off with our words. The Bible says the power of life and death is in the tongue. And one of the things we tell churches, we don't want you to have a church security team. We want you to have a church security ministry. And we also tell churches, you don't need an armed component, an armed church security team to have a safe church. Now, we do tell churches, pray and do what God tells you to do. But we tell churches and train churches all over America that you can keep people safe. And there's 3 main components. And before I tell you how to keep people safe, I want to say one more thing, is that the safer your church is, the faster it can grow. One thing we know is that people want to be safe. And we've seen this with homeschooling. Even before COVID-19, homeschooling was at an all-time high because parents didn't feel like their kids were safe at school. Since 1999, we've had 235 public school active shooter events. And since 1999, we've had over 1,700 violent church attacks. And so the 3 key things we want a church to focus on when it comes to making your church safe is, number one, every church in America, we want them to have a lockout plan. Most churches can't lock their front doors quickly. It's not that you're able to lock them, but we need you to be able to lock them quickly. Most churches don't have internal locks on Sunday school and kids ministry doors. We want every church in America to have a lockout plan. Secondly, we want every church in America to have a get out plan. I do church security training every weekend, and every hotel I go in has a written evacuation plan. Less than 10% of churches have a written evacuation plan. So we want churches to have a lockout plan, a get out plan, and in a worst case scenario where there is no other option, we do need churches to have a takeout plan. And that's how could we stop the threat. And there's a lot of ways when we do public school trainings, we're able to show churches, schools, organizations like Honda, how 2 unarmed nursery workers could potentially stop an armed gunman. We want churches to know, I wish I had a microphone, When your church is safe, it's like you put a microphone to your voice. It amplifies the message. And our whole goal in church safety is not to compromise the message that your church is preaching and sharing, but to amplify it.
It sounds like what you're saying, you're implying at least, is that there is not one way to do church security, that there's a diversity of approaches that could be taken, but all of them have the same goal. Do you think that maybe sometimes a pastor or a board, their idea of church security is a guy with the FBI wire coming out of his ear, a gun here, or a uniformed officer, and to them that's the antithesis of what they want people to experience when they enter their building, but it doesn't have to be that way.
The key is that we make sure we have these three principles, and every church has a different DNA. Some churches are large, some are small, some have multiple campuses, some have one service, some have three, but we just want churches in the DNA that works for them. How can I have a lockout plan, a get out plan, and a takeout plan? And one of the big keys, and this is really big, at Strategos, we're one of, if not the leader in America in doing public school active shooter training, is we want to make sure there's lockdown training at the church. Because one thing we see is that if a federal school has federal money, 100% of staff are trained in lockdown, but less than 1% of churches in their kids ministry have ever been trained, how do we keep our kids safe if there's an active shooter event? And all of this training can be done without a firearm. And the key is working the training into what fits best for that church DNA.
We heartily recommend professional church security training, and we heartily recommend Strategos. And there's no quid pro quo here. Strategos isn't paying us to say that. We just know excellence when we see it. We recommend that organizations partner with Strategos, if not Strategos, another professional level security consulting team to get training. I'd be interested in your thoughts. You know, there's an abundance in the United States of people who have concealed carry training or carry a concealed weapon within the confines of the law. The laws are different everywhere. And even pastors. And some of them may think, well, look, I don't need training. You know, I've already got concealed carry training. I like to go to the shooting range. I'm a good marksman. What's the difference between that level of competency and the level of competency that you train people to achieve in the uniqueness of a church with 100 or even hundreds of people around and someone causing mayhem in the midst of that?
Roy, that's a great question. Many states and many people have a concealed carry permit, and at Strategos, we believe in the Constitution, and we're grateful for the rights that we have. However, oftentimes we've seen that just throwing somebody in a school or a church or an organization with a firearm may make that situation more dangerous. And so we do work with churches that have armed security, but if they have armed security, we want them to have a law enforcement level type of training, not a one-day class, not a 5-hour class, an extensive law enforcement level firearm training. One thing we understand is that oftentimes, even if you have a firearm, you're not able to use it in a church because the crowd is so big. And so oftentimes we've seen this even with the Secret Service. In 1980, President Reagan was shot by John Hinckley Jr. The Secret Service was armed, they were justified, and they were trained. But even they couldn't use a firearm. There was such an intense crowd, they had to tackle the attacker instead of utilize their firearm. And so one thing we want churches to be familiar with is a shoot, no shoot scenario. We have numerous instances where somebody with a firearm has shot the wrong person. I alluded to it earlier, but CBS.com said 30,000 people were accidentally shot with a firearm last year, or unintentionally shot with a firearm. And so one thing we've got to understand is that we want to make sure that we're not overly reliant on one type of technique, but it's kind of like a tool belt. You have a screwdriver, you have a hammer, you have a saw, you've got a tape measure, you've got a marker, you've got a lot of different tools for every different situation. And that's what we want churches to have.
Barry, I'm sure that a lot of your training has to do with correcting misunderstandings about church security. And the information that I have would tell me that one of those misunderstandings is that the person who is likely to attack a church is that it's likely to be a anti-Christian, anti-church ideological zealot. And of course, those cases do exist, but that's not the norm. Can you inform us on, like, who is it that wants to attack someone at a church most likely?
Roy, that's a great question. I want to give you the top 2 triggers. So we're just going to give you empirical data that we get at carlchin.com. The top 2 triggers for violence in the American church. So last year we had 261 church attacks. We've had over 1,700 church attacks since 1999. And the 2 keys, the number 1 trigger is robbery. Number 1 trigger in a church is robbery. And so we always tell churches, don't die for stuff. At my church, we have a large church security team, but if somebody's going to take the offering, we let them take the offering. The only time that we would ever try to stop somebody is if they're going to harm somebody. At that point, then we would step in. And so when we look at this, we want to make sure people understand that the top trigger is robbery. The second leading trigger for violence in the American church is domestic violence spillover. And let me tell you why we see that as a big trigger. Let's say a man and a woman or somebody's in a relationship and the relationship breaks apart. Well, when the relationship breaks apart, you may not know where they live. They may have moved. You may not know where they work, but you do know where they go to church. And so what happens is we see a lot of altercations because of domestic violence spillover. And then specifically if churches have a Christian school or if they have a daycare. A lot of times a divorced couple, they'll have an altercation right there at the kid's place of teaching or learning or caring. And so those are your top 2 triggers that we've seen from empirical data. Number 1, robbery is the number 1 cause of violence in the American church. And number 2, domestic violence spillover. One of the things we teach at Strategos all over America is verbal de-escalation training. You know, the Bible teaches de-escalation. The Bible says in Proverbs 15:1, a gentle answer turns away wrath. And so 70% of the time, and I want the viewers and listeners to hear this, 70% of the time, if you have the right words to say, you can de-escalate a conflict. In law enforcement, we call that verbal judo. And so what we always want to do is let's use our words. Let's use the power of our words to de-escalate, to make sure that we do everything in human power to resolve this situation. Oftentimes, how can I help you sounds a lot better than what are you doing in here? And so that one simple phrase, and for the listeners, I want you to hear that one more time. How can I help you sounds a whole lot better than what are you doing in here?
Excellent information here, Barry. So we've talked about the fact that we encourage churches to partner with a security trainer. And can you walk us through what's that like? What will they experience? How can you help them? What are things that they don't need to worry about? And how can they have a comfort level with this going forward?
Well, if a church contacts Strategos International, first and foremost, we want to let them know we're not just a company, we're a ministry. And so if a church will just open up the doors, because we know churches have limited funds. If your church will just say, Barry, we would like a 1 or 2 day church security class. We'll come to that church for free, and we'll give that church 5 free spots. And then what we do is we have a small fee that we charge people in the community to come to the event. And as the church training grows, the host church gets more spots. Now, what we do cover is we cover every aspect we've talked about today. How do you have a lockout plan? How do you have a get out plan? How do you do verbal de-escalation? How do you do church lockdown? How do you make sure and we form the correct church security ministry? How do we partner with the right church insurance company? At Strategos, we don't exchange money with Ministry Pacific, but we like to align with Ministry Pacific because what we appreciate about Ministry Pacific is many insurance companies that insure churches don't understand the ministry aspect. Ministry Pacific has insurance, but they also understand how insurance applies to the ministry. And so we love that. And so we encourage churches, you have to be with the right church insurance company. One other thing on that is when we look at coming into a church, we always tell people, we're going to send you the best of the best. We have 200 people on the Strategos team. All of them have a law enforcement military background. but most importantly, all of them are Christians. They love the Lord, they love the church, and they want to partner with the church. You know, the Bible says in Proverbs 27:17, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Or Deuteronomy 32:30 says, one puts 1,000 to flight, two put 10,000 to flight. And our goal is to come along churches that are interested in free security training and just work with them to reduce their risk and to amplify the core mission of the church.
Well, that's a great explanation. And I think part of the amplification is that if you do have a security ministry that's competent and trained and continually trained, not a one time for all, if you're the pastor who is teaching or the Sunday school director who is taking care of classes or even the preschool coordinator, you don't have to be bearing the burden that somehow you are responsible also for security.
Roy, that's so good. If I can add to that, because you nailed it. For the listeners, I want you to think of the word team. TEAM going down, TEAM going down. And that stands for together, everyone achieves more. Safety and security for the church is everybody's responsibility. And when everybody just does a little bit part, it's amazing the difference it makes when everybody's pulling in the same direction.
Great point. Thank you, Barry. Anything else that we should discuss here today before we wrap up?
Well, a couple things. I want to encourage every listener that it always seems crazy until it happens. And so we do over 300 church security trainings a year. And our number one client, I wish our number one client was a before client, that they saw the need, they were forward thinking, they weren't reactive, they were proactive. But oftentimes the number one client of Strategos is churches that have been affected by violence, or a church in their town was affected by violence. And so we just want to encourage churches, be proactive. We would rather you have church safety training and not need it than need it and not have it. A lot of times people say, well, you know, Barry, it's going to be hard for me to talk to my church leadership about church safety. It's going to be hard for me to talk to church people about church safety and security. We always tell people the only thing harder than talking to church leadership or church people about church security is telling them why you didn't have it when somebody gets hurt or killed, or why you didn't have it when somebody gets injured. And you know, kind of the last thing I would say about Strategos, we understand that risks come in a wide variety. Of course, we want to protect churches from active shooters and violent attackers. But in our training, we also talk about having a medical team. It takes 4 to 9 minutes for the average police officer to arrive, and it takes 4 to 9 minutes for the medic and firefighter to arrive. We want churches to have a sexual misconduct training. 22 of the last 23 years, the number one lawsuit brought against the American church is sexual misconduct with a child. We want to keep people safe from medical issues, from social issues, from active shooter issues, from sexual issues. And safety always begins with the mindset, I'm going to be proactive, not reactive.
Excellent. Well, that's what we want to see as churches being proactive. Well, Barry, we appreciate you joining us today and sharing these insights. And we hope to see all of our customers take Barry up on this concept of being a proactive approach towards church security. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you, Roy.